Hello, and welcome to the Adventures on the Can-Do podcast. I'm your host, Jothy Rosenberg, aka the Incorrigible Entrepreneur. Adventures on the Can-Do explores the challenges and rewards of entrepreneurship, overcoming adversity, and where grit and perseverance can get you. My new book, Think Like a Startup Founder, based on my experiences founding 9 startups, seeks to help early-stage founders avoid the many pitfalls founders can experience along the way. This podcast adds to that stories of many fascinating founders who are my guests. You can see all the episodes of this podcast on my website, jothyrosenberg.com. Also, please follow and rate us at podchaser.com/adventuresonthecan-do. Today's episode is a bit different. I have no guest today. It's just me. I'm doing a solo one because guests and others have been asking me to tell my story here so that podcast listeners can get that context. So to do that, I'm going to answer the following 9 questions. Where does my grit come from? What is my theory about why disabled people tend to overachieve that my TED Talk was about? Where does the phrase, the rallying cry, if you will, "Who says I can't," even come from? What is the Who Says I Can't TV show about? I'll put the link for that in the show notes. What is the Who Says I Can't Foundation? What is the origin of my startup itch? What is my new book and who is it for? What is Adventures on the Can-Do Trail? And what is my idea for this Adventures on the Can-Do podcast?
You said you did a TED Talk about why people with disabilities tend to overachieve. What is your theory on that?
There are three. I think there are 3 traits that determine that, and there are traits that I think people with a disability develop naturally. The first one is insecurity. So it doesn't matter how accomplished you are, if you have a disability, a physical disability. Even I've had one for 52 years. You are reminded of it all day, every day. I mean, you get up out of bed in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and you have to find your crutches. Or I know a guy, a good friend, who's lost both his legs below the knees, and he doesn't bother putting his legs on. Takes too long, and he's got to go to the bathroom. So he crawls. And so there's this innate sense of insecurity. We also fall. I mean, we fall more than 2-leggers. So that's the first trait. The second trait is exceptionalism, which I just described kind of how it might occur. You know, it occurs from working hard, picking something you want to do, then being willing to focus on it and work extremely hard at it, and set little goals that you can achieve and celebrate before you move on to the next one. And that all kind of comes naturally. What people find not intuitive is the idea that you could be exceptionalism with innate insecurity at the same time. But that's exactly what creates drive. It's like, well, I have to overcome some things in order to sort of live with this insecurity. And so once I'd done that with skiing, then the fact that people stared at me off the chairlift when I was skiing stopped bothering me. It used to make me feel really insecure and bad, but when you're skiing really well, their staring turns into hooting and hollering and clapping for you. So that's the strange combination. And then the last one is just this discipline. So the third trait is discipline. Well, that's where you're willing to focus. It's because you want something so bad. You are going to maintain that focus, maintain that hard work. And so those 3 traits, insecurity, exceptionalism, and discipline, they come naturally to somebody with a disability, but it's not something that people with a disability have a lock on and no one else does. It's what I try to say to people at the end of my TED Talk is, you don't need to wait until you're disabled to benefit from these. It's just that most people just choose not to. That's my theory, and it's certainly been true for me. And I, in my TED Talk, I highlight the guy that lost 2 legs, and he's a world-class rock climber. There's the woman, Maureen McKinnon, who was a sailor and loved sailing. And one day she tripped over a line right at the edge of a seawall and flipped over and landed on her back 13 feet down and broke her back and is paralyzed from the waist down. And what she did was same thing as me. It's like, okay, I got to figure this out. I got to learn how to live in a wheelchair, but I can do more than that. She figured out what was needed for her to be able to get in and out of a sailboat, and she wanted to sail again. And then the next thing you know, she's getting better and better and better at it, and she goes after the Paralympics, and she was the first American to win gold medal in the Paralympics. And then the third one I highlight in the TED Talk is Kelly Bruno, who was born without a right leg. What Kelly did was, we've all, I think, figured out that sports is an area where you can, with the right choice and then focus and then hard work, you could get really good at a sport, and you might need adaptive equipment. Yes. And that's an area where you can have this feedback loop that's very positive and helps deal with your insecurity and helps rebuild your self-esteem. And for her, it was to become a triathlete. She's swimming, she's biking, she's running. And then she went on and she became a contestant on Survivor Nicaragua. And then she started running further, and she started doing 50-mile runs and ultra marathon beyond that. It spilled over to the other parts of her life. That grit, by the way. And she went to medical school, and now she's a doctor. And then she started a little company. And I'm going to have her on this podcast. She's amazing. And by the way, that is what happened with me. All of the successes that I had and the building up of self-confidence and self-esteem made it possible for me to choose to go to graduate school and get a PhD in computer science, and then basically all of these startups.
Where does "Who Says I Can't" come from?
"Who Says I Can't" is my motto, and it came from all the people saying "can't" to me in those early days. I felt like I had to fight back against "can't," and some people say, well, wait a minute, something that begins with the word "who" has to end with a question mark, and I beg to differ. I like to say it like this: "Who says I can't?" So then it's got an exclamation point, not a question mark. And by the way, up on my wall over there, I have the U.S. trademark on the phrase. So that was fun to get. And all through my life, once I kind of, instead of it beating me down, "Who Says I Can't" began to be a rallying cry, a motivator. One of the sports that I had not picked back up, and I was never a biker to be a biker. I had a bike as a kid to get from point A to point B, or just to wheel around and have fun in. I never even had the concept of biking as a sport on my radar screen. I was CEO of a company. It was actually here in Boston. And a young woman that worked for me asked if I would donate to her doing a bike-a-thon to raise money for AIDS research, where she would ride from Boston to New York City 4 days. And I was like, wow, that is unbelievable. Yes, I will donate. It's a great cause. And oh my God, that's impressive that you're going to do that. I was talking about this with some of my staff that day or a day or two later. And this one gentleman said to me, well, it's really sad that, that she's going to do that and that you're really excited about it, but that you can't do that. I looked at him and I thought, quietly, I thought, well, you're kind of an asshole, but on my way home from here, I'm going to buy a bike and I'm going to go do this next year. I'm going to do it. I got that bike. I had to get, of course, clip-in shoe and pedal so I could pull up on the pedal. And, my first ride was like a couple of miles and I was tired. It's like, oh boy, this is going to be a lot of work. I spent lots and lots of hours on that bike, and I started doing 70-mile rides before the event. I found a friend who was going to go with me. So that was helpful. We started in downtown Boston, and that first day we stopped in Connecticut, and the end of the ride was a huge hill. We're already really, really tired, and we go up this huge hill, and as we're going up the hill, and I could not stop and rest because to start up again, I have to be going downhill, so I'd have to turn around, go downhill to clip in. I mean, the flat is fine too. And then do a U-turn and climb back up. So my feeling was I have to finish this hill, and I would just gut it out. Well, I passed all these people who were walking. And of course, they were all two-leggers walking up this hill. And suddenly I started hearing people say, well, if he could do it, I'm getting back on my bike. And suddenly in that moment, with all these people making comments like that, for the first time ever, the thought occurred to me that what I do and just doing my thing is motivating to other people. And that led me to write everything what I just am telling you all in a book. And of course, the book had to be called Who Says I Can't? And it's out there and doing well, and people like it. Who Says I Can't is my rallying cry. It's a trademark. It's the title of a book. And then I turned it into a foundation as well.
You did a book, TV show, and a nonprofit with that name, Who Says I Can't. Can you tell us more about that?
The next thing I applied it to was a TV show, or an attempt at a TV show. I got discovered, I guess, by some fairly famous people. A guy named Jonathan Alter, very famous guy, written many books, was a writer for Newsweek magazine, and then was a contributor to the morning TV show called The Today Show. He had a little bout with cancer, and then he found out that when I stopped doing the AIDS ride, I did it 4 times, Boston to New York. I then switched to a ride which is actually the oldest and largest athletic fundraiser in the world. It's here in Massachusetts. It starts in Western Mass, and it's a 2-day, 192-mile ride, 110 miles the first day, and you ride from Western Mass all the way to the Cape Cod Canal. And then the next day, you cross the canal and you ride 82 miles to the tip of Cape Cod. And it's called the Pan Mass Challenge. And he heard about that too, and he wanted to ride in that with me and do a story about me. And he brought with him a producer who'd been producing some very big TV shows like 60 Minutes. And so I got to know him. And after that, maybe a year later, I called him up and I said, Steve, I want to do a TV show, sort of a documentary or a reality show, something like that. And I described what I had in mind. And it was, to highlight other people similar to me who use sports and got really good at them and everything. And he said, I'll do it on one condition. You have to do their sport with them. And I said, Steve, what if they do a sport that I've never touched? And he said, well, who says you can't? And so so I started a production company. So it was one of my little startups, was a little production company called Can Do Productions. I raised 120,000 from just friends and family for that. And we went off and we found three people, the three people I just mentioned. And we were going to do an episode on each one. And an episode would be a 14-minute interview, 60-minute style, facing each other, and a 14-minute of them doing their sport and me trying to do it with them. I had to race the Olympic gold medalist in sailing. Fortunately, I know how to sail, but and I thought I had her beat. She was kind of being a little bit taking things for granted, and she assumed she would be able to beat me easily. But suddenly, my boat was a nose ahead of her, and we were heading for the final marker. And she did some kind of weird maneuver, and she was able to steal the wind out of my sail and pull ahead of me. And she won by this much. That's it. That was fun. And then I did one with Kelly Bruno, but to get ready for that, I had to get a running leg. Oh man, and running with an above knee amputation is very hard. Kelly has a below knee amputation, so she has a knee, and of course I hadn't run in. By that time, it was probably 45 years. I wasn't quite getting it, but I had this leg, and I just wasn't running very well. And by the time that we were doing this thing with Kelly, but my biking was good and my swimming was good. So we did the swimming in a pool, and I was ahead of Kelly by the end. And then we did the biking, and I started off behind her, but my leg is very strong, and I have good endurance. And so about halfway through, I crept up on her and pulled past her, and I ended up beating her by maybe a full minute. So I had a minute on her in the bike and probably a minute on her in the swim. We probably did, half a mile swim. And then it was time for the run. And we start off, and she's got some friends with her, kind of help motivate her, and she's gone. And I'm like, really terrible running. It was a loop. I had to go around like 4 times. I think she beat me on just the run by 13 minutes. So she had like an 11-minute, overall win. That's where it should be. And it was great. And then I'll just tell you briefly the one with Hugh Herr. So Hugh decided that it was kind of, what I was doing was kind of weird. And he was not going to pick something easy to climb. He wanted to maybe see if I would, embarrass myself, honestly. I had to go get the shoe, and I don't know, these climbing shoes are so painful. Your foot is packed in to the point where you wince when you move, but the shoe can't slip. So it has to be like an extension of your foot all the way around. So I had that. And then Hugh said, look, you're not going to be able to wear a prosthesis. That would just be dangerous and no help at all. So you're going to have only 3 things, a foot and 2 hands to climb up. But we did it with ropes. And he went first, and then he was very encouraging. He went into, climber mode, which is very safety. And he was nice. And I did pretty well. I'm not a fearful person. I'm a risk taker by nature, actually only since all this happened to me. And the thing is it's in the Catskills, and it's called high exposure. And I think it's about a 200-foot cliff, just pretty much straight up. One funny thing happened. He says this has never happened to him before, but there was this little weird thing we had to kind of crawl through, and doing that, press the button that releases his prosthetic foot. All prosthetic legs are held on with suction. He hit the button that releases it, but he didn't notice it. And then when he came around the front of the cliff again, his leg just fell off. And, when a climber loosens a rock, they yell really fast. They yell rock down the hill to make sure anybody down there gets out of the way. We're doing, this is all happening. And then his leg is flying and he yells, leg, instead of rock. And his leg is bouncing down, almost 200 feet on the side. And the camera people were down at the bottom, pointed straight up. And they've got like $10,000 cameras. And they want to get a shot of this coming down, but they don't want to ruin the camera. So they took a few seconds of it and then got out of the way. And we thought, oh, this is bad. I mean, he's going to have to belay down without one leg on. But, they looked at it down there and they said, wow, this thing is tough. And they said, it looks okay. So we lowered a rope from up there. They tied it to it. We hoisted it up. He puts it on and he keeps climbing. Then a few years later, in 2014, I really wanted to get for other people some of the things that I'd been able to afford because of my parents and stuff like that. Like, outriggers for skiing. I have an adaptation for the bike that's good, but kind of expensive. And of course, running. Not that I wanted to run ever again. I had it with that. I regifted that leg and I've retired from running. I'm fine with it. I got a chance to taste it. So I started off right after the Boston Marathon bombing. It's just a coincidence that, my foundation was official and legal and all that a week before that happened. And when that happened, I got some big donations. So I had a nice bank account to work from. And I helped some of the bombing survivors who had lost legs. And I got, legs for several of them. But I since then, I've really wanted to focus on kids because, when it happened to me, I was a kid. So I just decided it's all about kids. For the last 6 or so years, and that from now on, it's focused on kids. And what we do is we find kids who have been disabled all their life or are newly disabled from something, find out if they're motivated, if they're, if they were active and if they want to get active again, and what sport are they anxious to get back into? Because even though insurance will pay, in our state anyway, in Massachusetts, it'll pay a significant amount towards a walking prosthesis, they won't give any money towards adaptive equipment for sports. So that leaves, the need. And what I know is that in some cases, if they can't participate in a sport, they may find that they get pretty depressed because, I'll give you an example. We're helping a young lady named Emma. When we first found out about her, she was 10. She was born without a right leg. She had a tibia, but no fibula, so it wasn't going to work. And they ended up amputating it. But she didn't know any different. And she had a walking prosthesis. She didn't like it very much. And she became this, amazing hopper around her house. But then gym class started to get more and more active sports, as they were in 4th grade. They were starting to do a lot of things that involve running. And she suddenly realized she was getting left out because she didn't have that leg. And she talked about it with her parents, and they're not well off. So, in fact, the insurance company doesn't pay 100% of walking legs. And so they had spent a lot on her legs. They were sort of, well, you're going to have to figure it out, Emma. And then we found out about her. And we said, well, no, Emma, we're going to get you a running leg. Now, they're expensive, $21,000. And so it's hard for us to help very many kids. And we usually help 2 a year, maybe 3. This last year, we were very fortunate. We helped 4. And so that's what the Who Says I Can't Foundation does. It's trying to help these kids. And we're always looking for, generous donations. The way I sort of scout kids is it turns out is the best way is through the prosthetists. These are the people who are going to build usually the walking leg. The one I've been using here in the Boston area for 25 years was a Paralympian in skiing. I guess that, makes it clear that he's an amputee too. So he's very sports oriented. Because he's an amputee, he understands fit and comfort is like the most important thing. And that is especially true of a leg that's going to be used in a sport where you're sweating potentially, where you're twisting in a different way than you do when you walk. You know, let's say it's a kid that had the same kind of cancer I did, because we've got two that we've helped that did. They have to come out of the hospital. They have to heal. They're going to be fitted with a walking leg. And it may not be by my prosthetist. Almost everybody who's looking around in Boston and trying to think about a sport for their kid is going to eventually come to the name of the organization is A Step Ahead Prosthetics, and my friend Bob. And so I find out about, he'll call me up and say, I've got one for you. And he charges me as little as he can, the cost basically. And I should be clear, he charges the foundation, not me. And we've been, I think the last 4 or 5 kids have all been through him. So Step Ahead Prosthetics is, if anybody's listening, is, and I'll put that in the show notes, is how you really connect with me, because Bob is going to say whether they're healed up enough, whether there are any issues to participating in the sport they're suggesting, things like that. But he's made a completely waterproof leg. He's made special snowboarding feet. He made my bike adaptation. He's amazing. When you're dealing with children, and it's something that differentiates this foundation from others, we are not a one and done. We stick with the kids until they're full grown. And there's only a certain amount of adjustment that can be done on a prosthetic leg to adapt to the growth. And at some point, you just need a new one. And remember, as I said, they're held on with suction. So, you know, you've got a socket whose opening is like, you know, this big for a child's thigh. But as they grow, they don't just grow this way. They're going to grow this way. And so they need a whole new socket. And so a socket is probably, you know, $10,000 or $11,000. But also, as their weight increases, the foot, and if it's a running foot, it's one of those blades, so that they're this big curve. They have a weight range where they work. And if the kid is too heavy, then it's not gonna break, but they're not gonna get the right amount of spring out of it. Emma, the summer after we got her a leg in March of 23, and then over the summer, like she'd only had the leg for a few months, she grew so much, so fast that it no longer worked for her. She had to have a new socket. Now, in her case, she didn't put on that much weight. She grew mostly this way for now. So she just needed a new socket. Her mother had not heard me when I said, we'll stick with Emma. She will not be left in a position where she's tasted running and suddenly can't again. So her mother was trying to explain to Emma that was fun, but sorry, dear. Luckily, that message got through to Bob, and Bob got hold of me, and I said, no, we will help her. We will stay with her.
How did you start down the entrepreneurial path?
I finished my PhD at Duke, and then I liked what was going on at Duke. There were some very interesting sort of quasi-academic commercial things going on that were really interesting to me. And so they hired me as a professor, and I was a professor there for 5 years, and I loved working with students. I was doing that, and one of the things that you have to do as a professor is get research. So I got a research. I won a contract with NASA to build a single board supercomputer, but it was a big board. It's like 2 feet by 18 inches that was going to go on board the space shuttle. It was essentially a supercomputer. It was supposed to be processing all the telemetry data that the space shuttle was getting to save having to send it down to Earth where it would get processed and then the results sent back. Sometimes the space shuttle is right in front of the sun. That prevents the radio signals from working, and then the space shuttle could potentially be in danger if the telemetry data wasn't processed quickly and warning it of something. That was a really exciting project. And as I was building it and it was working, I thought, well, gosh, this could be really valuable to some companies. I think this should become part of a new company. I started to say that to a few people, and they said, there's no infrastructure for that. They didn't actually say can't. There was no infrastructure for that in the North Carolina area. There is now, but there wasn't then. And so I said to my wife, I think we need to move so that I can start this company. And she said, okay, well, fine, as long as it's not California, because us Ohioans, we know that California is going to fall into the ocean at the next earthquake. So she said, where else could you go look? I said, well, Boston maybe. So I did. I thoroughly came up to Boston, looked at the scene, didn't exactly like what I saw back then. And I said, sweetie, I have to go look at California. She said, okay. Oh, my God. Ultimately, I found a great situation where there was people interested in a supercomputer that was similar to what I had been doing as research. They knew about my work because they really scoured the literature. And now I knew about them, and I wanted to join forces with them. So we became a founding group of 12 for this company in Sunnyvale, California. My wife is an incredibly good sport. She reluctantly said, okay, we're going to do it. And she had a great job, and we'd been there 10 years, and we had deep roots, but we pulled up and went to California. And we got there in the fall of 88, and in October of 89, the worst earthquake that's hit California since 1912 was 4 miles from our house. Destroyed 9 of the 12 houses on our street, not ours. We were very lucky. We lost all of our canned tomatoes and jams, became this giant pile of sticky, gooey, broken glass on the kitchen floor. But that was the worst of the damage. And once I got going with this startup, I had the itch to do startups from then on. So it was fun. We had a 4-year run. We made a phenomenal computer. We sold 100 of them, which is very good for a supercomputer. Ultimately, it did get sold, but not for much. Supercomputer companies are not hot tickets, but it was a great learning experience. But that was the only one I did in California. When I left there, I actually did a short stint, 5 years, at a large software company in Silicon Valley, who moved me to Boston with the intent of me helping to integrate a new acquisition and then come back. But when we got to Boston, we saw the quality of the schools, and we said, we're not leaving. This is a fabulous place to raise our kids and send them to school. And so we've been here ever since. That was 1996. We've been here ever since.
You have a new book coming out. What is that about?
After that first startup, I did a series of 8 more. Not all of them were in Boston. I actually did 2 that were based in Portland, Oregon. I am basically an insane individual, and I commuted out to Portland, Oregon, having my home remain in Boston. And there weren't even direct flights for those couple of years. But anyway, so regardless, I did 8 startups, and every one had a lot of things I learned. Sometimes I learned from making a huge mistake. Okay, well, wow, that was a big mistake. And sometimes that really, did damage to the startup, and it was a problem. And I was keeping track of those kinds of things. I was writing them all down. And it became what I called a series of anecdotes. Anecdotes means stories, short, and they were all on different topics because the areas that were of interest in each startup, where there were things that happened that were, I thought, worth noting, were all in different areas. And so it turned out in the end, I had a collection of about 31 of these. I say the number precisely because it's the number of anecdotes that are in the book, but I actually had a few more than that that didn't make it into the book. And they are on, all kinds of topics, like how to raise money from angels, and how the right way and the wrong way to put a pitch deck together. I did it wrong for a long time. And then how to do it right. And so I explain how to do it right in the book. There's one on what's a good board of directors look like, and what are board observers, and do you have to have them, and why? And I say at the very beginning of that anecdote, I don't like board observers, and I explain why. I say one of them, the title of the anecdote is "Investors are not your friend." I don't dislike investors, but they can't be your friend when you're the CEO or any of the founders of the startup. And oh, by the way, there's a whole anecdote on who should be a founder anyway, and who should be the CEO at the very beginning. Those are separate anecdotes. They're mostly in the first person, except where I have to be a little bit didactic about, hey, here's how to construct a data room for the due diligence that investors are going to do when they're considering investing in you. Oh my God, that would have saved me weeks and weeks and weeks of time to have what I'm putting in this book. It's easy to read because it's stories, first person. It's kind of like Who Says I Can't was my memoir of what happened to me health-wise and how I dealt with it. And this one is like the memoir of my startup business entrepreneurial career. And by the way, I would say the name of it. I will say the name of it. It's Think Like a Startup Founder. But the problem is, right now, today, tomorrow, they are changing the title, even though it's all done. It's supposed to go to the printer like last week, and now it's delayed because the partner of the publisher, sort of the big daddy partner, is Simon & Schuster, who said, hey, this is your first ever business book, because my publisher is a technical publisher of technical books. And the title you have and the cover you have, which is right there, are not going to compete well in the business book space. And my publisher was worried that this would upset me, because we worked hard on the title and the subtitle. In fact, the subtitle is currently Anecdotes of an Incorrigible Entrepreneur, which is me. And those are going to go out the window. And the publisher was really worried about that. And I said, Mike, listen, I'm responsible for the stuff between the front and the back cover. You're responsible for the stuff outside of that. And if you're telling me that changing the cover and changing the title will sell more books, then I am not going to argue one bit. Just tell me what it is. Send me a copy of the image of the cover. That's all. The estimated time when the book will be available in print. It's available now, and the link will be in the show notes as an ebook. The print book will be out 4 weeks after it goes to the printer. So 4 weeks from now, and give them another week, means it'll be for sure by the end of July, it'll be out. I've written 6 books. The first 2 were super deep, technical, weird kind of books. But, they were also things that I wish I'd had when I was working in that particular area of technology. And then the memoir.
And where does the adventures on concept come into it?
I've written a children's book. I did a lot of speaking to 4th and 5th grade classes. I was participating in a program called Understanding Our Differences, and I was trying to explain to kids that someone with a disability is not someone to be stared at. It's someone to understand what they're going through, what their needs are, and also, instead of staring, to ask a question, because almost everybody in the same situation as me much prefers someone coming up and asking a question as opposed to staring. And so I learned from the kids that the way to communicate with them was going to be through animals, that animals that have a physical challenge would be really interesting to them, and that a book that talks about that would be a good thing for them. Well, for them and for younger kids. I also tried speaking to younger kids, and it's a different experience. There's a little more empathy by the time they get to fifth grade. But I still want them at the earliest age possible to learn that you can have a challenge, physical challenge, that with maybe some help you can overcome, and then it's up to you, and you can kind of work hard again. So I decided to call it Adventures on the Can-Do Trail, because it's all about can instead of can't. And so the way the book is written is that it's a big format picture book. You meet an animal, and actually there's a human character named Nick who is meeting the animal. And the first image is all about them saying, I can't do this, I can't do that. There's a giraffe whose legs are short, very, very short. And he keeps saying, I can't reach the leaves. And his friends are saying, oh, since you can't reach the leaves, you're not going to get enough food. Oh. And so that's the woe is me, can't page. When you turn the page, though, Alex has worked with the animal, with his creativity and ingenuity with his feet, to come up with something that will help that animal overcome that challenge. And so then the animal is proclaiming loudly and proudly, who says I can't reach the leaves on that tree, or whatever the thing that they before thought they can't do. The idea when it's transferred over to this podcast is this is about all these people that have a lot of grit, that have the gumption, the fortitude to start a company. It's one of the hardest things we ever do. And they're telling their stories here. So it's the Adventures on the Can-Do podcast. I'm planning to write more children's books, which will be, I have the next one written, and I'm working on finding an illustrator, and it's called Adventures on the Can-Do Savannah. And we'll have Adventures on the Can-Do Jungle, different things. Lots of fun. Kids love it. It's on Amazon in paperback, but it's really better, much better in hardback. And you go to Barnes & Noble to get it in hardback.
And this podcast, who is it for, and why are you doing this?
This podcast, this Adventures on the Can-Do, is essentially by and for startup founders, entrepreneurs, and people that work around those kinds of people. The goal is, if you kind of imagine this book as being my stories on a whole bunch of subjects relating to the 9 startups that I did. Let's say it's that much stuff. But then someone comes on and they've got a whole different market, a whole different company. Everything's different. And so their story adds to this. And the next one adds to it. And the next one adds to it. And so by doing these podcasts, and I'm not planning to stop, the number of founders is astronomical. It's just huge. I'm being very successful and lucky to find a lot of them, great ones. They're just going to keep creating this larger and larger body of useful information. People will be able to go through and quickly see by the titles what's the topic, what's the emphasis in each of these. I think it's helpful. I'm also just very frankly trying to find ways to get the word out about the book, because the publisher will do a good job, as they always do, but that still is probably 10,000 copies. There are 150 million startups in the world. So 10,000 startup founders getting this book is a drop in the bucket. And I know I can't get into the millions. That's reserved for famous people that write novels. But I want to get it into more people's hands. And so this podcast and maybe some speaking that I'm going to do should get it into more people's hands.
That's going to be a wrap for today. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Adventures on the Can Do podcast. Remember to share and like us on your social media channels and check out the show notes for additional resources and links. I'm Jothy Rosenberg saying, hasta la vista.